In January 1979, Brooklyn, Thomas DeSimone walked into a room expecting to become a made man. That's the version most people know. What's left out is that the decision to kill him had already been building for years. In the 1970s, New York's mafia ran on control and structure, where mistakes were contained before they spread. But DeSimone had already crossed lines, starting with the disappearance of William Bentvena and later drawing the attention of John Gotti. What happened next wasn't sudden. It was the result of pressure that had been building quietly and couldn't be ignored. The system behind the violence, the American Mafia in New York, operated less like a street gang and more like a structured enterprise built on order, discipline, and long-term control. At the center of that system was the Commission, a governing body formed to regulate disputes and prevent open conflict between the major families. Its purpose was simple: keep business stable and avoid attention. Beneath it sat the bosses, capos, soldiers, and associates, each layer tied together by loyalty, profit, and strict boundaries. Violence existed within this structure, but it was not random. It was regulated. Decisions involving force, especially lethal force, were expected to follow a chain of approval. Killing a made member without authorization was not just a violation. It was seen as a direct threat to the stability of the entire organization. This system depended on predictability, construction contracts, union influence, gambling operations. Everything required a level of trust between groups that were otherwise built on secrecy. If individuals began acting outside the rules, it introduced uncertainty into deals that relied on quiet cooperation. Leadership understood that unchecked behavior could trigger retaliation, disrupt alliances, and draw unwanted scrutiny from law enforcement. So when a rule was broken, the response had to be calculated. It wasn't about anger or revenge in the moment. It was about restoring control. An unauthorized killing signaled that discipline had slipped somewhere within the network. And once that happens, the risk spreads. Others may begin to test limits. Rivals may see weakness. The system, which depends on control, starts to erode from within. In that environment, anyone responsible for creating that instability becomes more than just a problem. They become a threat to the structure itself. And threats, sooner or later, are addressed. If this kind of story interests you, consider subscribing. The First Crack, Queens, New York, 1970. In 1970, inside a bar in Queens, New York, a moment that should have ended with words crossed into something far more serious. William Bentvena, a made member of the Gambino family, returned from prison and stepped back into a world where respect carried weight. What began as a verbal exchange quickly turned into violence, and that violence went too far. Bentvena was beaten, taken from the location, and later killed. His body was concealed, and those involved believed the problem had been contained. But in a system like this, a made man does not simply disappear without consequence. Even without proof, the absence itself creates pressure. Contemporary accounts and later reconstructions of the case consistently point to this killing as a key trigger behind the events that followed, including the eventual disappearance of Thomas DeSimone. At the time, there was no immediate response, no confirmed culprit, no direct retaliation. But that silence was not resolution, it was uncertainty. And in an organization built on control, uncertainty is a risk. The longer the truth remained hidden, the more it weakened internal trust. Leadership was left without answers. And without answers, they could not act with certainty. What happened that night did not end there. It created a problem that stayed buried, quiet, unresolved, and building pressure beneath the surface. Silence as a threat. For the Gambino family, the disappearance of a made member without a clear explanation created a problem that could not be solved through immediate action. There was no confirmed culprit, no witness willing to speak, and no direct proof that could justify a response under the rules they followed. In that kind of environment, acting without certainty carried its own risk. Moving against the wrong person could trigger retaliation, damage alliances, or expose internal weakness, so the family held back. But that restraint came at a cost. Silence, in this world, is not neutral. It creates space for doubt. A missing soldier raises questions about leadership, about control, about whether the system is still functioning as it should. Other crews begin to notice. Rivals pay attention. Even within the organization, uncertainty spreads quietly. If a made man can vanish without consequence, it suggests that the structure meant to protect and regulate everyone may not be as secure as it appears. Over time, that kind of unresolved situation begins to weaken authority. Leadership is forced to operate without clarity, balancing the need to respond with the risk of making the wrong move. Every day without an answer adds pressure. And in a system built on control, pressure without resolution does not fade, it builds. What started as a hidden act of violence becomes something larger, a test of whether the organization can still enforce its own rules. Eventually, that test demands an answer. A personal war emerges, as the earlier uncertainty remained unresolved. Another development changed the nature of the situation. Tommy DeSimone became involved in a killing that connected him directly to a rising figure within the Gambino family, John Gotti. The victim, Ronald Giroth, was not just another name. He was tied to Gotti's circle, and that connection gave the killing a different weight. This was no longer just about rules or protocol. It became personal. Records later linked Girothi's killing to DeSimone, adding to a pattern that was already drawing attention. But this time, the problem wasn't just what had been done, it was who it affected. At that point, Gotti was not yet the figure he would later become, but his influence was growing, and so was his reputation. He was known for protecting his circle, and for remembering those who crossed it. That changed the balance. A grievance tied to someone in his position does not remain isolated. It begins to shape how situations are viewed, how long they are tolerated, and how they are eventually resolved. What had started as a hidden violation of rules was no longer contained. It was becoming something else, something that carried weight beyond the system itself. Fragile alliances, mid-1970s, Tommy DeSimone did not operate directly within the Gambino family. He was associated with the Lucchese family, working under a crew that maintained its own operations while interacting with others across New York. This kind of arrangement was common. The five families often functioned like connected businesses, separate in structure, but linked through shared interests, joint ventures, and mutual understandings. Those relationships depended on cooperation and, more importantly, on respect for boundaries. Tommy's actions began to strain that balance. The unresolved disappearance of a Gambino member, combined with a later killing tied to someone within Gotti's circle, created tension between the two families. From the Gambino perspective, there was now more than one reason to look closely at the same individual. From the Lucchese side, protecting one of their own carried risks. Supporting him too openly could damage relations. Distancing themselves too quickly could signal weakness within their own ranks. This is where the structure reveals itself as something more than a loose network. It operates under pressure, adjusting to risk while trying to preserve stability. Alliances are not based on trust alone, they are based on shared benefit. When one side becomes a source of repeated problems, that balance begins to shift. Conversations happen quietly, positions are reconsidered. What was once manageable starts to look like a liability that affects more than just one crew. By the mid-1970s, the situation had moved beyond a single incident. It had become a broader issue, one that involved relationships between families, the influence of rising figures, and the need to protect the system from further instability. More like this comes next. Subscribe to keep up. The internal betrayal inside his own crew. The line that held everything together was loyalty, shared work, shared risk, and the expectation that problems stayed internal. That line was crossed when Tommy DeSimone's behavior turned inward and became personal. Accounts from the period, some of them disputed, suggest an incident involving Karen Hill while Henry Hill was in prison. Whether every detail is exact remains unclear, but what mattered was how it was perceived inside the crew. This was not business. It was a breach of trust that cut across relationships that had been built over years. For Paul Vario, who led the crew, the situation forced a decision. Protecting Tommy meant carrying a growing list of risks, past actions, rising attention, and now a personal violation that could not be smoothed over with a conversation. In that world, loyalty has limits when it begins to threaten stability. What looks like betrayal from the outside can be framed internally as risk management. At some point, the calculation shifted. Information that had been held back was no longer protected. The unresolved questions surrounding earlier events, especially the disappearance of a Gambino member, suddenly had a direction. Passing that information across family lines did more than settle an old question. It aligned personal motive with organizational need. The system did not react in a single moment. It adjusted. And in that adjustment, Tommy lost the protection that had kept him insulated up to that point. From asset to liability. 1979. By 1979, the balance had moved against Tommy DeSimone. His value within the crew, experience, connections, willingness to act, was now weighed against the risks attached to his name. Those risks were no longer isolated. They had accumulated over time. An unresolved killing tied to a Gambino soldier, a later incident connected to a rising figure within that family, and growing tension between crews had all narrowed the margin for error. There was also the issue of family exposure. Reports from law enforcement and later accounts indicate that one of Tommy's brothers had become an informant. In an environment where association alone can create suspicion, that detail mattered. It did not need to be proven in court. It only needed to exist as a possibility. Within the Mafia, a perceived weakness can be treated the same as a confirmed one if it threatens the wider structure. At this stage, decisions are rarely about individuals. They are about the system. Protecting someone who carries multiple points of risk can create larger problems, damaging alliances, inviting scrutiny, or signaling that rules can be bent without consequence. Removing that risk, on the other hand, restores a sense of order. It shows that the structure still holds. Tommy's position had changed. What once made him useful now made him dangerous. And in a system built to preserve itself, dangerous elements are not debated indefinitely. They are addressed. The disappearance. Sometime in January 1979, Tommy DeSimone was called to what he believed would be a formal step forward, a ceremony marking his induction as a made member of the Gambino family. According to accounts from associates, he was picked up and taken to a location in the New York area. After that, the record breaks. He did not return. There was no official report, no confirmed witness, and no body recovered. What exists instead are multiple versions of what may have happened. Some accounts, drawn from later testimony by informants, describe a shooting carried out by Gambino members. Others place different individuals at the scene or suggest that more than one person was involved. Details vary, and in some cases contradict each other. None of them can be verified with complete certainty. That uncertainty is not unusual in cases like this. Organized crime often removes problems in ways that leave little trace. No physical evidence, no clear timeline, no single narrative that can be confirmed. The absence of a body limits what can be proven. The presence of conflicting stories makes it harder to establish a definitive version. What remains consistent is the outcome. Tommy DeSimone disappeared, and no effort was made within that world to question it publicly. The system did what it was designed to do: resolve a risk, close the matter, and move forward without leaving a record behind. Final thought: the real reason. Tommy DeSimone wasn't killed for a single act, not for one insult, one fight, or even one murder. What ended his life was a pattern that kept building, each decision adding pressure to a system that depends on control. A missing Gambino soldier with no clear answer, a killing tied to a rising figure like John Gotti, tension between families that needed stability to keep business running, and finally a betrayal from within his own circle that removed the last layer of protection. In that world, survival is not about loyalty alone. It's about value, and once someone becomes a source of risk instead of profit, the outcome is rarely debated for long. Tommy's story ends not as a sudden act of revenge, but as a correction, one the system makes quietly, without record, and without hesitation. There is no grave to visit, no confirmed version of what happened in that final moment, only the result. If you want more stories like this, where the truth stays hidden beneath the surface, subscribe and keep following.